The Aurelia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the talk this evening. I just want to give a thank you for your ongoing support for the OMAH-History Speakers Series. So in honor of International Women's Day that was held on March 8th last week, tonight we welcome Dr. Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux as our guest speaker with her talk, The Reality of Reconciliation in Canada and Abroad. Dr. Wesley-Esquimaux is a dedicated social justice advocate, is well qualified to speak on this important topic. She is a member and a resident of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation on Ontario, and has dedicated her life to building bridges of understanding between peoples. She is deeply committed to public education and sees endless merit in bringing people from diverse cultures, ages, and backgrounds together to engage in practical dialogue and applied research initiatives. She serves as the first Indigenous Chair of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada for Lakehead University, where she continues to develop pathways forward to reconciliation across Canada. She was introduced as an honorary witness by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in 2014 and chairs of the governing circle for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. She was an inaugural Nexon Chair in Indigenous Leadership at the Banff Centre and is a board member on several organizations across Ontario. So what is truth? What is reconciliation? And what does coexistence actually mean? What will it take to make reconciliation and coexistence a reality?
So thanks for that. Anyway, thanks for that invitation, and thanks for that acknowledgement, and thanks for the background that everybody just heard. I was listening to it thinking, oh wow, she's a busy girl. Anyway, I just want to say, International Women's Day. I actually got an opportunity to go up to Wasauksing, which is just by Parry Sound, and had an opportunity to spend some time with the Indigenous women there and have a conversation with them. I am right now coming to you from beautiful Banff, Alberta. I'm looking out the window in front of me and it is snowing like crazy. So this is, I guess, a good thing because the last couple of days have been very sunny. And I'm here with a Indigenous Women in Leadership program. It's called Calling Our Spirits Home. And it's interesting because this is what we're trying to do with people right across the country, is we're actually encouraging a restoration of culture, restoration of languages, restoration of wise practices. What is it that we need to do as Indigenous peoples to regain the kind of health and well-being that we need to have into the future as we reconstitute our nations across Canada? So there's a lot going on across the country. And so I'm talking to you about reconciliation. I'm talking to you about truth. I'm talking to you about how do we get along? You know, how do we become a society that actually not only welcomes each other and welcomes strangers from afar, and certainly embraces the idea of indigeneity in Canada, because it's been here all along. It was here when you got here. Those of you that have come from other countries over the course of generations, but it's also an important contribution to the health and well-being of this nation we call Canada. Many of the people here this week, all of the women are talking about, how do we preserve and protect the waters? Because women in our cultures are responsible for the health of the waters. We're talking about the land and how important it is that the land be protected. And we understand economy. Everybody understands that there's a need to create resource extraction in different places so that there's an economy that sustains healthcare and all those things we've come to enjoy and appreciate in a country like this. But there's also a need to preserve and protect the natural world. and everything that surrounds us. And being in a place like Banff, you really get an understanding of that as you look out the window during the workshop, and there's a whole bunch of deer standing there watching you watch them, or the elk as they majestically pass by the window while you're sitting having your coffee. So there's a lot of things about this place that are really important. And those of you that know that I'm from Ontario also can appreciate the work that's going on in Ontario and the many activities that an organization or a university like Lakehead is deeply involved in. And sustainability is one thing. We're saying, there's a need for sustainable actions in every sense of the word, but there's also a need for regeneration. How do we come back to a place where we understand what farming is about, like sustainable farming, regenerative farming for families, not necessarily the big things, but what do we do as people to plant more trees and to understand that the trees that are dead have to come down and that they can be utilized for some very important things as well, turn into pellets to be put into fireplaces and things like that. So there's a lot of reasons we're talking out here about these things, and we're also talking about the need for ceremony, and how important ceremony is, and how important it is to have a spiritual practice so that we have a sense of being larger than just what we see in the mirror or just what we see, on this Zoom screen, that there's so much more to each one of us, and all of us can work together in unity to create something even better. So, those are the conversations that I'm deeply engaged in. The conversations around truth are really important as well. I just read an article by an intellectual property lawyer in Toronto, and his whole article was refuting the Indian residential schools period and saying, yeah, we had Indian residential schools in Canada, but the reason we had them is because the state of the lives of Indigenous peoples in their homes was so terrible with alcohol addictions and all these other things that we had to have these schools to put these children so that they had a safe place to live. And he doesn't even actually seem to consider the idea that the reason that people were drinking alcohol at all was because they took their children in the first place. That at the very beginning of the process of colonization, settlement, whatever you want to call it, that, as people, missionaries interfered in people's lives and told them that their spiritual practices were no good, as educators came along and told them that they were learning the wrong things, that our ways were no good, and that our children had to go somewhere else to learn something different and learn English. Those were the genesis of the things that we're seeing today in our communities. And so he doesn't even acknowledge that. It's just like, oh, everybody's blaming the residential schools, but that's not the problem. It was people that were drunk that was the problem. And it's like, wait a minute, there's always a beginning here, and we always have to take that into consideration. So I've been traveling a great deal over the last while, not only to places like Banff, and that's really what I wanted to talk about as well. So there's Genesis everywhere. I have been to Norway twice now to talk to the Norwegian government, the Canadian embassy in Norway and Sweden. I've talked to the Sami people, the Sami nation in Finland, in Sweden, and in Norway about the truth commissions that they are establishing, because they also had similar kinds of experiences as have happened in Canada. They're not calling it truth and reconciliation. They're calling it truth commissions because the commissions themselves have been established to only deal with a certain kind of truth. And the truth that the commissioners told me they wanted to explore was about the loss of language. So in Norway, they had a Norwegianization process. In Sweden, they had a Swedification process, they called it. Finland probably had something that was named something similar. And these are very new processes. And the interesting thing about them is that they are, in fact, they are looking at the loss of language and the detrimental effects the loss of their own language, the Sami nation languages had. They're also looking at the loss of lands in the northern parts of Norway and Sweden and Finland, where they did practice reindeer herding. And the loss of that industry as time went by, and of course the losing of their land access so that they could actually continue that process. You need a lot of land when you're dealing with animals like that, and that would be true of cattle ranches as well. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So those conversations are ongoing. The unfortunate thing is that a lot of the conversations between the Norwegian and Swedish and Finnish governments are not necessarily at this point deeply engaged with the population, with the Indigenous population, the Sami nation. So there is a Sami parliament in Norway and in Sweden that is actively engaged. The Swedish Sami parliament does not have a home. It is they meet in hotel rooms, they meet at restaurants. They are recognized, but they are not actually funded in any way so that they can actually do their work more effectively. In Norway, they actually have a Sami parliament in northern Norway that is incredible. They have like a whole industry built around their parliament. So I think they're going to be a lot more successful as they move forward, having those conversations. I've also had occasion to go to Taiwan. Taiwan is actually starting a reconciliation and coexistence reconciliation process, which is, again, very different. They're looking at ways to create that coexistence between there are many Indigenous people, and they at one time had as many as 36 Indigenous languages in Taiwan. 11 are still viable and are still utilized by the Taiwanese Indigenous peoples. They took us north into the mountains to meet with some of the Indigenous people, and they too are doing a reconstitution of language, just like we are in Canada, except they're way more focused on making sure that happens. They have a Council of Indigenous Peoples, which has been active for the last 27 years, but they do not have the Reconciliation and Coexistence Commission actively up and running yet. So they're working on those processes as well. So I'm kind of giving you this so that you understand that there's a lot of activity going on. And I've been in those places to have conversations with them. As the chair of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, I have been asked to attend to those places to have a conversation about what happened in Canada. How did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission get set up? And of course, it was a push from Indigenous population. It wasn't Canada's great idea. It was actually ours. We had to convince Canada that this was something that was necessary. And it was also pushed for languages and an understanding. Not everybody had residential schools like we did. But there was language loss, there was poverty, there was a lot of things that happened that created the kinds of circumstances in which we now are living. The same thing is true in the other countries, but the approaches, as I said, are somewhat different. And the goals that they have established for themselves are also somewhat different. So we're having this conversation. So I'm giving them the sort of the goods on what did we do in Canada? What was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about? What were the 94 calls to action? And actually have said quite clearly and unequivocally, do not hand this to your government. Keep the work that's going to go forward in the hands of your people. It is the hands of your people that are going to form this and create the kinds of things that they would like to have for the future. The government of Sweden, the white commissioner, was very clear with me. We don't want to talk about anything other than language. And I said to him, if you're establishing a truth commission, there are going to be many things that come forward that are a part of the truth. And he said, we don't care. We don't want to talk about that. We want to only talk about the language and restoration of language. So, there's some narrowing of focus that is going on. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't think that that's a possibility. I think that once you invite people into the conversation, especially Indigenous peoples that live in remote communities in Sweden, they're going to have things to tell you that you may not want to hear. But they're going to tell you, and you're going to have to listen. So clearly, a lot of the work that's going on across Canada, a lot of the work that's happening in other countries is about the ability to listen and to not get defensive as commissioners, as governments. That the things that you're being told are going to be very important components of the work going forward and how we live together into the future in a good way, no matter what country we're actually talking about. I've also been invited to go to Brazil, which is another interesting conversation on reconciliation, because they're also contemplating the ways that they can also initiate a truth and reconciliation kind of commission in Brazil. And they also are thinking about how do we go about establishing a national center in Brazil that's going to be a place where records, as we pull them together, can be stored. And the interesting thing about Brazil is that their president has said pretty clearly and unequivocally, this is not a conversation we want to have. So really, at this time, it's the academic community that has said, well, this is a conversation that has to be had. or we can't move forward. And there's been a lot more violence, I think, in that country than in other countries around this conversation. So it's interesting. I mean, Canada does not have a bloody history, unlike the United States, where there was a significant number of Indian wars and massacres. I don't think you can call them anything else. Canada does not have that kind of bloody history, but it does have a history of removal. It does have a history of starvation. It does have a history of discrimination and colonization. It does have all of those things. But in spite of that, when you come to events like I'm at the Banff Center, you meet people, women in particular, who have done an incredible amount of work over the course of their lifetimes. And many of these are young women, not as old as I am, that are doing incredible work across the country to actually lift in astonishing ways their people, lift their children. They're raising their children very differently. I'd say all of the women here are non-drinkers. Some of them spoke about how their parents also stopped drinking. My mother has been sober for 36 years. My father has been sober for 45 years. And how important it was to them that those things happened. And I personally have been in positions where I have noted the research that has been done by Indigenous peoples themselves on those kinds of questions, and better than 50% of the population of people of age to actually consume alcohol do not. And the young people I worked with at the university at Lakehead when I was still in Thunder Bay, many of those children, young people, had never ever touched alcohol and had no intention of ever doing so. So there is a definite shift in another direction in Canada, and I think that's really important that we understand that even though sometimes people like me who work across communities, work across the country, work internationally, sometimes see some things that are not good. We also see more things that are actually going extremely well. So I think that it's important that you understand that and you appreciate that, even if the news only shows you the negative, because that's what the news is all about, right? They want us to, they want to sensationalize things. But on the ground, I want you to understand that the women in many of these communities are doing incredible work. Establishing health centers, taking on industries that they were never welcomed in, like the gas and mining industries. They are working in those industries. They are sitting on boards and giving, offering up their voices on the kinds of decisions that have to be made into the future and the kinds of things that are important to their people. They are now there's many more chiefs now than there have ever been women chiefs that there have ever been in the past. And Elsie Knott in Curve Lake, Ontario, was actually the first woman chief in Canada. The elders that are here today that came from the Stoney Nation and are teaching here this afternoon said that Bearspaw First Nation, which is here in Stoney, there's 3 First Nation communities that are sort of joined together, is the first First Nation in Alberta that had 2 women chiefs, not contiguously, one and then a couple of years between and another one. That's almost unheard of in the Stoney Nation, but it's happened and is happening. So again, lots of incredible changes. So reconciliation. So the truth is one thing. Truth is an important piece of this conversation because the only truth is not the negative truth. There are very many positive truths that are happening around us on a regular basis that are really important and significant. Reconciliation is not just about what the government of Canada or the government of Sweden or the government of Norway, Taiwan, Brazil, or any other country decides to do. Reconciliation quite often happens on the ground, and it happens between you and I. It happens when I'm willing to speak up and tell my honest story about my life and also the successes that I've achieved, and when I observe young women doing the same kind of thing. It also is about my reaching out to you and understanding your life and understanding your opinion and your place and your migration to this country, or your great grandparents' migration to this country, and the fact that you are also born here. This is also your home. It is not just our home. Even though when I sing the song, it's our home on native land, but it's everybody's home now. And, I've had many conversations over the years with chiefs who have said, well, they should just go back where they came from. And it's like, you know what? Nobody's going anywhere. And the only way we're going to build this country and continue to build this country into a real model for unity and coexistence is by actually reaching out to each other and shaking hands and understanding that it's our obligation to ourselves and to our children, to our families, to our neighbors, that we understand each other and we learn that we are going to be working together on that future. And that is really what reconciliation is about. It's about opening your heart, opening your mind, and opening your doors when it comes to places like education and funding education in the right spaces so that we get kids that are actually willing and interested in getting educated and actually going to college and going into trade schools and going into universities so that they have higher education. It means opening up our understanding of what child welfare in this country is all about and why kids are still being taken into care when that isn't even essential. Poverty is not a crime. Poor people raise children in a good way. Many of the people that immigrated to this country had nothing when they got here and they were able to raise children, but nobody was interfering necessarily with their ability to do so. They didn't have that stigma of being a Native person. There's a need for more work with the churches. I've been working with many of the churches in Canada on a covenant which recognizes the history of the relationship between the churches in Canada and Indigenous peoples. It has not been easy. A lot of the churches have not really understood what their roles and responsibilities are around that reconciliation process. It's not enough to say, okay, we're going to do better. It's not enough to say, we're sorry that we did badly in the past. What is necessary is, what are you doing now? What is the action you've agreed to undertake today and into the future to ensure that more Indigenous people feel welcome in your church, more Indigenous people sit on your boards or on your committees, and that they understand the history of our relationship, that it wasn't always the greatest, and that it can be healed. That it can be healed. So those are the kinds of things that I think are important. What are the actions? The actions that any one of us can take it can be done right at home, like right in your neighborhood, right in your town. I'm always telling people, I'm not looking for grand gestures. I understand how difficult it is for anybody, anywhere, to take on as big a story as the relationship between Indigenous people in Canada has been. That you're not going to solve the problem, and neither am I. I'm doing my best to do what I can do to reach out and have those conversations like this one this evening. And I'm happy. I'm going to speak for just a few more minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. But it's also important for you as individuals to do the necessary research to understand just your own territory. If you're from Ontario, learn about the Ontario treaties, the pre-Confederation treaties that were drafted. Learn about the Williams Treaty, which took so much land for so little. And all those years that we had to fight to have that concern resolved, which, by the way, at one point when it was resolved in 2018, was the biggest land claims resolution process in Canada at $1.1 billion. There are bigger ones now. And, I can tell you, because I've been at this for a very long time, I can still remember having conversations with federal officials saying, if you don't solve these land claims, and I'm talking 20, 30, 40 years ago, if you don't solve these land claims and listen to what people are asking, it is going to become a very expensive proposition. At the time when I was young, a lot of the chiefs said, if they gave us 1-2% of the national, economy of resources that they take off our lands, that would be great. Now we're talking through conversations where it's like, we want 51% of the ownership of whatever's going on. We want, there's bigger dollars at stake now. And that they were warned about that, but just never really paid any attention, thinking that it would never come to those places. But it has. But here's the thing about resolution of different kinds of processes with the Canadian government, with Canadians generally. It always benefits everyone. So that land claim, just for example, in Ontario, at $1.1 billion went to, I think, 6 First Nation communities, and there was equally divided. It was put into trust. Some resources were put into individual hands, with a big story around that too. But the realities is the resource goes into banks. We don't have a bank at Georgina Island. There is no Bank of Rama, although there is a bank on Rama. Christian Island doesn't have a bank of Christian Island, and the other communities. The money goes back into the economy. It goes right back into the towns and settlements and businesses that are adjacent to or close to First Nation communities that have settled those land claims right across Canada. We go buy our cars at those towns. We may stay in those hotels. We go to those restaurants. We continue to shop for our groceries in those places. We put money that we may have generated from those land claims into the banks. We buy our clothes. So, the whole territory around a land claims resolution process is actually enriched by those resolution processes. So consider the truth and reconciliation processes that are happening here in other countries much the same way. The more resolution that is generated between people as individuals and also peoples as communities or cities actually generates goodwill and then generates better outcomes for everyone. So Indigenous peoples feel welcome applying for positions in those places. They return to school and feel welcomed and funded so that they can, still continue to look after their families, or if they're young parents, they get better jobs, they rent better places, they buy homes. They buy another car. So everybody benefits. And we keep telling people that there's no benefit to keeping people down. And the cost of doing nothing is extremely high, extremely high. My family, I was the first person in my mother's family, my mother's side of the family, to go to school, to actually get, I did graduate from high school, not like most people. I graduated at 23. I was going to school in Palm Springs, California, and I went back to school at night school, and I got my GED, and then I started college, and then I came back to Canada, and I went to the University of Toronto, worked as a vice chief, and worked in research and land claims and negotiations and many things like that, and then went back to school, to graduate school, earned a master's degree, because I looked at what the heck happened in this place. Why are Indigenous peoples in the positions that they're at? And did a research project that looked at the aftermath of humanity after the bubonic plagues in Europe, where they lost 50% of the population, and the aftermath of the epidemics in this continent, and people lost their lives and were killed by the diseases. And we're all human. We all reacted quite the same. There was addictions, there was death, there was debauchery, there was sexual violence. There was a lot going on in Europe and on this continent. And then my doctorate, when I continued on, I did a PhD, was on the continuing effects of unresolved grief and trauma on Indigenous populations, because I wanted to understand what happened. But the good news is, my finishing a doctorate and going to work, when I finished it in 2004, there was not a lot of us, but today there is an incredible number of Indigenous peoples with master's degrees, undergraduate degrees, and even PhDs. So once we begin the process, other people follow. And in my mother's community, where I don't think anybody had actually completed a university degree, we have at least 3 PhDs the last time I looked. So that's, those are good things. Those are good outcomes. Those are people who are now working in industries right across Canada. In Thunder Bay, we have master's degrees, we have PhDs, we have people in every kind of industry and every kind of coursework across the entire university. And then many of them go into industries that are in the territory, but many of them also go back to their home communities and start working there. And starting health centers and working on education directives and doing all kinds of other things. So reconciliation, we had to get to the truth. We had to say what was on our minds. We had to say what was in our hearts. We had to say what it was keeping us down. You had to know that there was a very good reason behind what you thought you were seeing in Indigenous populations across Canada. You had to know that there was a genesis to much of that dysfunction, much of that harm that you were observing. And now that we've had an occasion to talk about it publicly, it has effectively lifted a lot of the darkness off. And many of the next generations are saying, well, we're not going to get stuck there. We're going to do something different with our lives. We're going to do something different with our governance systems, our languages, our ceremonies, all of those things that make us who we are. And so that's what I see. So, we're kind of in that place. And the other countries that are doing this work, it is going to be a struggle, just like it was in Canada. It's not like everybody in Canada in government, in the conservative government, and even the early liberal governments said, oh, this is a great idea, let's do it. In fact, I listened to some elders being interviewed at a conference one time for elders, and I heard them say, to a camera, because they were videotaping this, that they had gone in to see the Liberal government. This is prior to the Harper government, to ask about, are we going to do this truth and reconciliation process or not? We want to talk about residential schools and the impacts of those schools. And a Liberal minister said, over my dead body. A Liberal. So it wasn't like, oh, everybody always agreed that this was the best thing to do, and the Liberal government always agrees. They do not. So it's important you understand that. And I mean, we tried to work with Stephen Harper on a number of initiatives. When it came to the missing and murdered Indigenous women, he said it wasn't on their radar. We tried to talk to him about a number of different initiatives that were important to us. He closed down the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which was very significant to a lot of people across the country who managed to get a lot of their healing work done through that process. That was an unfortunate piece as well. We have not regenerated an Aboriginal Healing Foundation, but we are doing the healing work that is essential for our communities to move forward. Are there still problems? Yes. We're still struggling in places with addictions. It's not just us. I mean, I think you can look anywhere in Canada and see that there are people that are struggling with opioid addictions that are not Indigenous, have nothing to do with Indigenous peoples. We're in an era of incivility in many of our societies. I think it's really, truly based on a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear after the pandemic, the being locked up for 3 years in our houses without proper time and attention to the things that are important to us. We're still in a post-pandemic era. We're not done with being afraid that it's going to come back and come back harder. We're now in a state of climate change. Although again, there are people that are naysayers. This is just a cycle. But I listen to Indigenous peoples from Northern Territories, and they tell me that it has changed dramatically where they live. That the tundra is softening. That there are issues with their animals as they cross the tundra. So so we have lots going on, and our children are quite aware of that. They see the extreme weather events that are occurring around them. They are concerned. And so that fear is being generated. And I would say, as I move closer to opening this up to questions, that all of us, I mean, I'm 68 this year, so I remember many decades of different kinds of things being the fear of the moment. I remember, bomb shelters and those kinds of developments. I remember lots of things that have been considered over the past as potential threats to us. So we're in a new era of new threats and AI and all the rest of it. So we have lots to think about, lots of questions. And I want to say this to you, take a look at some of the post-apocalyptic books that have been written by Indigenous authors. Take a look at Indigenous authors. I'm happy to send a list of books to the people that have set this up. Take a look at those books and think about what they're saying when it comes to how will you survive the potential loss of the comforts in which you're accustomed to experiencing. Can you return to the land? Do you know how to set up shelters, start a fire, live without a grocery store down the road? Can you live without your car? Can you live without the amenities that are provided to you on a daily basis? Healthcare being one of them. How will you survive into the future if something happens that is irreversible in some way? They're very interesting, and I think it's worth your while to have a look at what's available to you to understand how the Indigenous mind has been working. And also, there are post-apocalyptic books that talk about how the Indigenous population and the things about Indigenous people that are so important in terms of their ceremonialism and their ability to think outside the box, the proverbial box or the colonial box, that non-Indigenous government would come after them again. that they would be holding things like dreams and the ability to dream that would be lost on the general population who would come looking for it. So really fascinating conversations from the very people that at one point in time were told that they had no ability for complex thought. That would be us. So in fact, we do. We have lots of it. So I'm going to leave it there. There's lots to talk about. I'm happy to answer questions. Just let me, close this off by saying, be aware that there is a lot going on with Indigenous populations across the entire continent, the entire world, that we have capacity, like everybody else now, to talk to each other and to support each other in these initiatives. And we are reaching out much of the time across those boundaries, and a lot of the countries that I'm working with right now that are initiating these reconciliation processes are looking to Canada for guidance and looking to Canada for our experiences so that it can help them understand the kinds of steps that they need to take to move into the future in a good way. So I'll leave it there. Let them open it up to questions, and I'll be happy to have a conversation with you for the last portion of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wesley-Esquimaux. I would love it if you could send the book recommendations. Could send them to Monica, and I'll take a look at them.
Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay. So our first question is by Trish, and she asks, besides the actions you mentioned, are there any actions we can do locally to become more aware and educated?
Well, depending on where you live, yes. I always recommend to people that they attend to the local friendship centers. That's what they are. They're friendship centers. That means that you're welcome, and you can become a friend. I would say that that's certainly one thing that you can do. I don't encourage you to go knocking on doors on local reserves or anything like that. But there are schools in those communities, and sometimes they need help, and they might welcome it. I can still remember meeting a woman, a non-Indigenous woman. I was sitting next to her at one of the Anishinaabe Nation conferences she attended, and you can attend these conferences as well. And she said, I'm a retired baker. And she said, I'd really like to be able to do something. And I said to her, they just opened up a kitchen at Dennis Franklin Camardi High School. It's an Indigenous high school, and they need a baker. And maybe you should go talk to them. And you know what? I saw her about a year later, and because I was at the school, and she came out of the kitchen and she went, and she was baking at the school. So that's one thing. If you're an artist or you have access to galleries, these kids are amazing artists, and they have no real access to anybody that can actually take their work and assess it and get it shown. They need writing supports for their students in schools. A lot of the kids struggle with books and reading because they don't have access to, especially in remote communities. You can become a support at a night school. Or you can teach the language at a night school. There's so many things you can do that are just like, yeah, I'd like to be involved, and offer your services.
And then we have another question from Pamela. She asks, how does reconciliation ground political resurgence and maintain Indigenous resistance?
Well, I think that there has to be a lot of acknowledgement on the Canadian states side of things. I think, you need to know that Indigenous populations are deeply engaged in their own reconciliation process, their own truth process that is very grounded in their own communities. Like so much light has shone on our communities that we're now looking at each other saying, we got work to do. So that's one thing. And then the support of the Canadian state on those works. So one of the things I say to people all the time is, when First Nations peoples or Métis peoples or Inuit peoples come to you for assistance, just give them what they ask for and nothing more. They don't want you to save them. That is not what this is about. That you have to ensure that First Nations peoples have the autonomy, the resources, and the wherewithal to do their own work, because that's going to be the best kind of work. And stay out of it unless you're invited in.
Okay, so Helen asks, since many Indigenous reservations are remote, is there a way to use things like Zoom for education, reducing the need for going to boarding schools, at least for the first 12 years of life?
We use, there has actually been remote education in a lot of the remote First Nation communities in Anishinaabe for many, many years. And people can graduate from high school. And now, I mean, Memorial University in Newfoundland has actually been graduating nurses and graduate degrees for probably at least the last 10 to 15 years. So there's a lot, as I was saying, as I was talking, there's a lot going on that is not necessarily in the public domain. People are not necessarily aware. Do we have high schools in remote First Nation communities? Not everywhere. There are some, but it is pretty expensive in a small community like mine, for instance, 350 people. We have a school that goes from K to 6, and then the kids go across the lake and go to one of the local public schools, and then they can go to college in Barrie, or they can go to university in Aurelia. But how do we get around that? Well, we can only really do it by distance education. But we also learned something, I think, through the COVID period, that children do not do as well with education remotely as they do in person with their peers. So we have to be thoughtful about that as well. So how do we, so there's a lot of conversation going on about how do we make that happen? But I don't think we can build high schools all over the North and remote communities across Canada, because it would be incredibly expensive to do so. But one of the other things I will say about education is if you look up Teach for Canada, it's just tefc.ca, I think. Look up Teach for Canada. We have been recruiting teachers for northern remote communities in Ontario, Manitoba for the last decade. It's a charity. But our teachers have to be certified. They have to like to go outside into the north. They have to be flexible as they teach, because you're teaching in a remote community. So you better learn how to pluck a duck, and you better learn how to scrape a moose hide. And those are built right into the education system, so that the kids that are living in those communities are not only learning about science, they're also learning about their own territory and the science that is actually all around them. So that's another thing you can think about is Teach for Canada.
Hi, Cynthia. Your emphasis on Indigenous writers has made me want to mention Gathering, celebrating First Nations stories. He says, coming to Rama First Nation May 31st to June 1st. I have seen this event over the past few years as a real invitation to reconciliation and learning more of the truth at the same time. I know you have a conflict of interest on this issue, but would you comment on the value of an event like this to both communities?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it as a conflict of interest. I attend when I can and speak. For a while there, it was actually in conflict with my convocation at Lakehead, so I couldn't always make it. But no, I think that these are invaluable because it brings people together. It's in a comfortable setting. There's food. There's laughter. There's quotes from the books. Some of it's kind of heavy, like Five Little Indians is not an easy read. But it's quiet enough and packaged in a way that people feel welcome. Not only the Indigenous people, but the non-Indigenous people who come from all over the place to actually participate. But one of the things that I know brings people together and makes people happy is laughter. And laughter is the best medicine.
How do you learn about potential volunteer opportunities you just mentioned, and how do you connect to them?
I guess I would peruse we call it grandfather Google, and take a look at what's there and just type in, Indigenous conferences. There are Indigenous conferences in diabetes. In fact, I just got invited to one in Halifax. And there are conferences in child welfare. There are education conferences. Go look up Inspire, INDSPIRE, Inspire, which is an education institute. They have education conferences throughout the year, and everybody's welcome to participate in them. There are local events like the Rama event for writers that are really important. And the friendship centers often hold things. There are powwows all summer long, which you are invited to. Those are public events. And maybe it costs you $10 to get in, but it's about, trying out the fry bread and, looking at the artifacts and like these earrings. These are earrings from northern Norway. It's a moose. It was made by a Sami guy. Sammy guy, no, and you can do, but try the food. Try the different kinds of drinks that they have available. Meet some of the seniors. Watch the dancers. There's so many things that you can do that you can get to know Indigenous peoples. I send my students all the time to powwows across the summer, and they're happening every weekend all summer long.
What would you recommend when working in publicly funded education when colleagues refute or reject reconciliation and are dismissive of Indigenous content in the Ontario curriculum?
That has been a big challenge, I think, for a long time for all of us. I still remember students coming to me in tears when I was working in the social work, Masters of Social Work at U of T. And I would just say to them, don't give up. Like, keep introducing those articles, keep bringing them forward. The art, it's an important part of this country. And I tell people, well, why do I have to know about this stuff? Because your Constitution says that it's important. Section 35 says the rights of Indigenous people, Métis, First Nations people, are a part of this country. There's the Royal Proclamation of 1763. There are treaties across the entire country that are still viable, sacred. They're living documents. You need to know something about it. There's negotiations going on as we speak on natural resource extraction development, oil and gas. There are Indigenous people sitting at the table, free, prior, informed consent. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has been accepted by this country. The principles for education have been endorsed by the university presidents across the entire country. All of the primary schools are doing their land acknowledgements and recognizing that it is essential. I was listening to this, talking to this man, and he said, I know this is going somewhere because I took my sons up to the Muskokas last summer. And we were standing up on a ridge, and we were looking out over the vastness of the forest in the Muskokas. And I said to my son, "What do you think?" And he said, "I think it belongs to the Indians." So he said, I was like, "What?" So clearly that the word is getting out there. And by the way, the word Indians being reclaimed. I'm hearing it everywhere. My mother used to use the term Indian. And trust me, I would never correct her, and neither would you. That's the word she grew up with, and that's the word she used. And it's being reclaimed. And by young people, it's like NDN, and it's being reclaimed in many ways because it has been a part of our culture and communities and language for so long. And I understand the negative parts of it, but I think the reclamation of different kinds of elements of history for Indigenous peoples is equally as important. It is to academia, and academia has endorsed this movement forward. So you may still struggle, but I would say don't give up. And I will also say this: you get far more people listening to you with goodwill and kindness than you'll ever get by shouting people down or insisting in a negative way that something change. It has to be done in a good way and collaboratively and with a smile. And I mean, we get far with that.
Are Indigenous burning out dealing with both their own resurgence and settler goodwill?
Yeah, I would say, yeah. I would say probably. But here's the thing. I mean, this is what this conference is about that I'm at right now with these Indigenous women from across Canada, is the very conversation around self-care. That, we have taken on an obligation and responsibility to ensure that people have a better understanding of Indigenous peoples across Canada, especially in their own territories. They are, there's some tears, they're, talking, especially when they're working in businesses or industries that are very, very colonial, very extraction oriented. They don't often get listened to, or they get put down because of their viewpoints. That is a recipe for burnout. When you're constantly fighting to be heard, but they are determined. I listen to the women speaking, especially the young ones. They know that it is not going to be an easy road ahead. I can tell you that there's been times in my life where I've said to myself, if I see another Indian, I'm going to puke because I'm so tired of fighting this battle. And then I look in the mirror and go, yeah, well, whatever, keep going. So self-care is a very important consideration for that. Taking the time to relax, be with your friends, your family. I have 2 cats and a dog that, that provide me with a lot of respite. I think about that all the time. I've been doing this work for over 40 years, probably 45 years, since I was 16 years old. and join the Ontario Women's Association. So I am deeply immersed in this conversation. I know without any doubt that this is a big conversation. It is huge, but I don't have to solve it all. I only have to do what I can do. And I think that that's something that we all have to accept.
CUSO operates with adult volunteers serving as teacher aides in remote schools in the far north of Canada. Have they been approached to do the same in fly-in communities in Ontario or Manitoba?
Probably, but we do that. That's what Teach for Canada does. They actually are working with fly-in communities. They are recruiting the teachers. They are doing the interviews and ensuring that they're a good fit for those remote communities. So that's what I'm saying. If you go look at Teach for Canada's website, you can see a lot of the videos that have been created by the teachers that have gone to the north. They have to sign a 2-year contract with us to go. We have a almost 90% retention rate. They stay. Some of them have stayed for 6 years or more, and some of them have become principals, have taken the principals courses in our principals. I think it is a very rewarding thing to work in the north. The schools are challenging, I know, because when I was doing my doctoral work, I taught as well because the teachers kept leaving. They'd be there for 2 weeks and then they'd leave because they couldn't handle it. That's more than 20 years ago. But I'm still saying that it is still a challenge for people who live in cities and have done their practicums, teaching practicums in city classrooms, are challenged by working on the land and working with children who have experienced a lot of loss. Because most people don't understand, when you look at a child that has gone through 6 teachers, they're grieving that. I tell people, how many of you have had a teacher, like especially white teachers, how many of you had a teacher, you grew up in Toronto, that you know, Miss Miller was the best teacher ever, and you know, you knew her for all through your like several years, and she's still at the school. That's not often the way it is in remote communities. Sometimes they stay, a lot of times they don't. So we look very diligently at the teachers that we hire to go into the north, and the schools themselves in the north choose the teachers. We don't tell them. We just give them, here are 20 teachers for you to choose from.
How do you see what the effect of our huge immigration will have on reconciliation?
If we keep expanding the conversation, we're now talking to 5 different countries that are doing this work. I think it's going to have an impact if it's not taught in these schools. I think if people don't understand what reconciliation actually means, and we have a lot of conversations about what does it mean. You know, is this conciliation? You know, what are we reconciling here? I mean, is this an essential component of our ability for us to coexist into the future? A lot of people say there's no such thing as reconciliation. So I think, Taiwan calling it a reconciliation and coexistence commission seems to be quite effective for them. And I'm wondering if maybe it's the language language, is a tough thing. Like, there's a lot of people come from other countries and even our own populations across Canada that when you ask them about Cree, a Cree word for that, or you ask about a Saulteaux word for that, or a Stoney word for that, they're like, well, there's not really any word for that, but there is a word for getting along, like that speaks to collaboration, or it speaks to unity. There is no word for that because reconciliation is assuming that something happened that has to be corrected, and that somebody has to do it. So the idea of forgiveness, or the idea of opening a dialogue that is non-confrontational and also has action associated to it, is a challenge for a lot of people across the country. So immigrants coming in, they're not necessarily informed about Indigenous people. Prime Minister Harper took that out of the immigrant, the statement that they make when they become a Canadian. The Liberal Party has put it back in. There was Indigenous people that actually were part of that conversation. So, I think education is the answer. I mean, Murray Sinclair has said as much.
How hopeful are you about recovery of the Indigenous languages? What methods are effective?
Very hopeful, actually. Even my granddaughter is now speaking the language. Her mother has learned the languages and is teaching her daughter, and she's teaching her French, by the way, so she'd be trilingual. I think I did some of the research not too long ago because I was doing a presentation at a language conference. There are more children, Indigenous children, actually children, not all Indigenous, because our schools in the North, any kid is welcome to come in and learn Ojibwe or Cree or whatever. There are more children in Canada speaking the language now than there are elders speaking the language. So is it perfect? No. But there is definitely a resurgence of the language and people really working hard on preservation of their languages. Absolutely. I think it's going to be okay.
What are the roles of wampum in reconciliation?
The wampum belts, not everybody across the country has wampum, by the way. The two-row wampum has been held up as a place of beginning of the conversation around reconciliation because there are two rows. And it's like, our canoes and your ships, and they should sail along on their own streams and not interfere with each other, which is, I think, a great premise to begin with. But the other thing that we cannot forget is that those two rows are sitting in three other rows. The white beads also have meaning of peace, friendship, and respect. Or other kinds of phrases that are utilized by the Haudenosaunee people. The wampum, the dish with one spoon, which was done between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people in Ontario, was done before contact. And that one says, we only have one dish. We all live on this planet. And if we need to eat or support or sustain each other, we only need one spoon because it's all about all of us together. So there's a lot of emphasis. If you go look at the wampum belts that were done, and there's a whole story around, we don't have time for it, but you want to do another session on wampum belts, I have the perfect person for you. There's a whole thing about those belts that's really important. And the lessons in that are very much about unity and working together in harmony.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for your ongoing support of the OMAH Speaker Series and for joining us tonight for this very important presentation and conversation we've had with Dr. Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux as our guest speaker. It was very enlightening. Your overview of what's going on here in Canada, but also on a global scale, has been very educational and eye-opening and has led to a very engaging discussion. I find it also very inspiring what you're doing. It's just truly amazing that you're representing Canada and learning more about other communities globally and seeing how you can help them and how we also can learn from them. So I thank you, Miigwech, for being here tonight.
Yeah, Miigwech to you. Thank you.
Great. The OMAH Speaker Series will continue on April 17th via Zoom with our guest speaker, Dr. Frances Hellyer, Professor of Education Emerita at the Lakehead University. Her topic will be History Education Through Art. C.W. Jeffreys draws the history of Simcoe County. So you may not be familiar with C.W. Jeffreys. He was a contemporary of the Group of Seven, but he's best known for being an illustrator of textbooks. Dr. Hellyer has researched the history of education, including the adoption and use of textbooks in schools. She will share Jeffrey's work during a presentation focusing on his drawings depicting Simcoe County history, while also providing a fascinating glimpse into the representation of Canada's past in the early 20th century textbooks.